All right. Well, OBS shows our faces. It shows our voices. That's a good thing. And finally, I get to say good morning to someone because you're living in the past. I'm living in the future. I'm 2 hours ahead of you. So good morning,
That's right.
Alan. How are you, sir?
Good morning. I am just fine, Nate. How are you?
I'm doing great. I got a haircut this morning, so I'm feeling kind of spiffy about life. My
Are
beard isn't
you? Are
quite so
you? I'm
crazy.
still cutting my own hair.
Oh my God. See, I
I
don't have
started
that
doing
talent.
that. I started doing that. Well, I'm keeping it short. Is the
Yeah.
thinner my hair gets, the shorter I cut it, and
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing
so
wrong with that.
I got one of these clippers with the comb thing on it, and it's makes it relatively easy. There's no eyeballing involved. You can do everything with these
Now,
combs.
do you,
So
do you remember the infomercial for like the vacuum hair
I
cutter
do
thing?
remember those. I just was talking about that with a friend the other day, and you can still get things like that. I
Really?
saw an ad for one the other day that had this built-in vacuum. It doesn't
Oh
hook
my
up to a
God.
vacuum cleaner.
Oh, that's what you know. There's people are gonna be watching this like, what? What are they talking about? That
Now you
doesn't
can still
exist.
get them. Yeah, this is like the world's best gadget for people that don't know. Right? Is that it was basically a hair cutter like a lawnmower that spun around really fast. And you connected a vacuum cleaner hose to it, and you could adjust the height from the lawnmower down to your head. And you stuck this thing on your head and turned the vacuum cleaner on, and it just went back and forth until your hair got shorter.
What could possibly go wrong?
What
I
could
mean,
possibly
at
go
least
wrong?
there's
Yeah.
less mess. You know, I remember in college, one of our, I guess he was a resident assistant or whatever, the slightly older student who lives on the same floor as you and quote unquote keeps the peace. One of
Uh,
the ways he would make a little spending cash was by cutting people's hair, and it was always just this. I don't know how it ever got clean because there was just hair everywhere. It's like I would not
yeah.
want to do that in my dorm room, but so be it.
So there you are.
There we are. So yeah, no, I'm all trimmed up. I'm looking good. So life is good. So for the folks who are not as intimately familiar as I am with you and your background, you and I've shared an awful lot of meals together over the years. What's your origin story? How'd you get into this weird world of computers and
Um,
what brings you to this place in life?
if we go all the way back, I was a medieval history major at the University of California.
As one does.
Yeah, right? And I was also a musician. And I started taking computer classes because I got interested in computer music and I wanted to learn how to make my own synthesizers. And which turned out to go nowhere is that I did that for a few years. And one day I was sitting around fooling around with the synthesizer and I realized that I had about a 10-to-1 screwing around with the synthesizer to actually making music ratio. Is that the I'd mess around with the computers for like an hour and then I'd make a minute of music and then I'd mess around and it's like I just got fed up with the whole thing and started playing the piano again. So it's revelatory, right? You push your finger down and sound comes out. It's
Yep.
just amazing. But anyway, I started with that. And then I started taking computer classes for that reason. And then at some point I realized, I'm only a few classes away from having the major.
Sure.
If I take the idiotic classes, right, the big O notation, NP completeness kind of classes, which I hated and got D's in, but I did pass them. But if I took those classes, then I would end up with a double major. So I did that. And then I got out of school building robots. As my first two jobs were building robots. And for one of the robotic systems, we were using a Motorola chip that um, back at the time, Intel had really, really good support for the developers, but they had the less desirable chips. As Motorola made the best chips, but they had zero developer support.
Sure.
So we opted for a Motorola chip, and we didn't have a compiler, and we didn't have an operating system. We didn't have anything. So I wrote all that stuff. I wrote a
Oh
compiler. I
wow.
wrote an operating system. By the time I was done with that, I was a programmer instead of a hardware engineer. So, then I fortuitously got a job with Dr. Dobbs' Journal. An ex roommate was working with Dr. Dobbs as an editor. They lost their C columnist, so he called me, and the rest is history. Is that
So you bring up music, and that's an interesting thing to me because I know a lot of people in software that have either their music majors or they did a lot, they played a lot of instruments. What is the connection you think between music and software that seems to be a relatively consistent sort of thread?
I think my theory is that first of all, it has nothing to do with math. It's all this business of music
Sure.
is somehow mathematical. That's just bonkers. It's just not true, right? Good music, and it's all intuition, right? It's
Yeah.
all it's all these sorts of things that the music as math people can't imagine it. So I think the connection is focus.
Oh,
Is that we introverts like to focus on stuff. And getting good at an instrument requires a lot of focus, and it requires sitting down and practicing hour after hour and just all these things that extroverts are not particularly good at.
sure.
So the same things that make us good at the same personality traits that make us good at programming, ability to focus is a willingness to work at something hour after hour in order to make it better, that kind of stuff applies to music too.
Sure.
So when you're a kid, you're not going to be programming computers, at least not when you're like 6 or something,
Right.
but you can play an instrument. So I think what happens is the sort of personality traits that will make us good programmers later on come into play much young when we're much younger, and we pick up the instruments before we do anything else. But it's basically the same mental things we're going through. At least that's my theory.
That's an awesome point. And the other piece that I think is interesting is you have to be willing to be pretty bad at it for a while before you get good at it. And I mean, I've seen that certainly with music, right? But I also remember that with software is you have to kind of work through that frustration of, wait, it didn't compile. Oh, there's an error. Like, what's going on? And you got to grind on it, or else you never get to the, oh, wow, look what I just did.
Yeah, but there are certainly no end of both musicians and computer programmers that don't know how bad they are.
Well, that's fair. That's fair. And
yeah, I think that goes with it too, right? As we none of us know that we're as bad as we actually are. We'd be so discouraged that we wouldn't keep doing it.
It does help to be tone deaf, I guess, right? To a certain extent, like you can't, that's why you have the noise canceling headphones.
That's right. Both
parties wear noise canceling headphones for a reason. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it from a focus perspective, but I'm sure everybody has been in that state, whether it's with music or with programming, where you just kind of lose track of time.
And that's
so much fun.
But that is the thing that makes you a musician.
Yeah,
being able to do that, right? That flow, right? That being in the flow, is that good musicians do that, and they do it very quickly. As they get really good at entering the flow and leaving the flow without any messing around.
Yep.
And if you can't do that, you almost can't be a good musician. If it takes you 10 or 15 minutes to get to the point where you're playing instinctively rather than not, then you're not there yet.
Yep.
So it's a central part of, I think, again, both activities. There's a lot related. So the math stuff, though, is who cares about math? I got lousy grades in math through my whole career. I hated math. And of course, none of us have used it, right? Like everybody else that has a CS degree, I had to take like almost 2 years of calculus, all this other garbage that I've never used.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of irrelevant.
No, I agree.
Algebra. I had to use algebra the other day, and I actually made an equation. And
no way.
I haven't done this. I hadn't done it in so long. I had kind of forgotten how to do it. But
oh, I knew I'd never be able to do that. My brain just does not think that way. And as I look back on my collegiate stuff, I took a philosophy class that was far more applicable to what I was doing in software.
I took a great philosophy class.
Math. Yeah, I mean, it was all good.
Of course, when I was in school, the only way to get formal logic was through the philosophy department. They didn't teach you CS.
Yeah. That was the class that stood out to me. I took a logic class, and you see the applicability of that to software, instantaneously. In my experience. Yeah. Why don't we teach more of that, do you think? Why do we focus on math?
Because originally, not originally, but say back in the 60s, computers were seen as glorified adding machines.
Right.
So, and the applications at the time, the original applications at least, were things like targeting cannons and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so the whole idea of a computer was, let's start off by having this machine do the arithmetic for us that we mathematicians don't want to do, and cryptoanalysis and that kind of stuff. Yep. So what ended up happening is that CS, the study of computers, programs, was seen as a branch of mathematics.
Right.
It was the computing engine that you use to get rid of the grunt work in mathematics. And it was kind of an ancillary thing to mathematics. It was this thing that you learn in order to help you do your real work, which was the mathematical theory. And that idea of CS departments being a branch of math got really firmly ensconced in the university system to the point where it was almost impossible to break out of it.
Right.
And there is an interesting story. I don't have a PhD. The reason I don't have a PhD is that when I finally decided I wanted one, which you didn't need for years, right? Back in the day, a PhD was actually a negative, as people wouldn't hire you if you had one, because they said, "Oh, this guy's a theoretician. We don't want to hire a theoretician."
Exactly.
So I decided, okay, I want to get a PhD, and I was living in Berkeley at the time. My first child had just been born. I didn't want to like go out of my way, so I applied to Berkeley. The only place I applied was to Berkeley. At that point, I had my compiler book, wherever it is, right? It's a 1,000-page tome, right? And so I applied to Berkeley, and I kind of submitted my compiler book along with the application, saying, here, I know what I'm doing, and they turned me down. They turned me down. Cal would not admit me, and I appealed it to the dean, because I was like really pissed. So not to the dean of CS, but to the kind of uber dean.
Right.
And all that person was willing to do was put it back to the admissions committee and say, we need a reason.
Sure.
And I have the letter to this day. They said, we read your book and we're not impressed. And
wow.
The interesting thing about that statement is the book was being used as a textbook at MIT and Caltech and IIT at the time. And oddly enough, the book was being used as a textbook at UC Berkeley.
No way.
And they still would not admit me. And so what is that really, right? That's fear. Because what we're looking at here is that they were threatened. They were threatened by some person who could write a 1,000-page book on compiler design that was half code.
Oh my Lord.
Right? There were implementations of Lex, implementations of YAC, implementations of a compiler. And I think they were just terrified of it. They just didn't want somebody like me in the department who could demonstrate the fact that they weren't programmers.
Right.
And so the issue is that's not unusual, is that when the book finally came out, it went out for peer review, of course.
Yeah.
The peer reviewer that I paid attention to was Brian Kernighan's, who loved it. He said, this is a great book. He said, we were talking about the code. He said, I've got my quibbles here and there, but I wouldn't have done anything any differently than you did. So I take that as a big stamp of endorsement when Brian himself is saying,
pretty hard to go wrong there.
But there was this clown at Princeton, right? And he said there is no use for code in a book of this sort, that being a compiler design book. And I'm going, oh. And then he went on to say, he said the proper way to approach this subject is to write a book that covers the relevant mathematical theory, and the implementation is trivial. And I'm going, there speaks somebody who's never written a compiler.
Small matter of implementation detail, Alan. How hard could it be?
So anyway, we're going through, this is my experience with academia. And I'm actually, this year I'm a professor at Mills College. I'm a distinguished professor of computer science at Mills College this year. It's a visiting professorship, which I'm doing mostly for fun. They're paying me peanuts, but I just thought, oh, this would be nice. Yeah. And I am really enjoying the heck out of it. It is fun. That's awesome. But I still don't have a PhD. It's just that Mills was open enough to say, you're like, I think you have enough credit at this point to hire you without needing the PhD. But I don't know that Cal would have done that. If UC Berkeley had a visiting professorship open, I don't know that they would have let me teach it. So, so there we are. So, getting back to your original question, I think the problem was that CS was originally seen as a bunch of mathematics, as kind of mathematics. The departments then were full of mathematicians that were not programmers. And that system has perpetuated over time. That the people who get tenure are the people who are like the people that already have tenure. Right. So the system has been perpetuated, and there are very few schools that have broken out. The best of the best engineering schools, MIT, right? They've broken out of that. Right. But and oddly enough, the junior college system at the other side has broken out of that because they're focused on getting people work. Right. But the universities in the middle, no, they still seem to be as bad as they ever were, with the same old curricula that are as bad as it ever was.
That's how we've always done it, Alan.
It is how we've always done it, and there we are.
Well, and I think as I look back on my professors, a lot of them were undergraduate math majors, because at the time they went through, there wasn't an undergraduate computer science degree, and many of them may have gone on to get a PhD in computer science, but they had this strong math background. And I remember my advisor in particular telling me repeatedly, "Oh, Nate, you would love higher level math. You would enjoy the heck out of it. It's philosophy." And I'm like, well, that may be true, Jim, but I'd have to get through the lower level stuff to get there, and we're hitting this roadblock in the middle called
that's exactly right.
That's a problem for this brain. So that never worked out for me, but I can live with it. that small matter of implementation detail makes me think about almost every project manager I've ever had. What do you mean
Yeah.
it'll take that long? I think it'll take less time than that, don't you? So one of the other things that I know you're a well-regarded expert on, world-renowned expert on is agile. And I was thinking about this morning a little bit, and I wanted to pick your brain around agile, how we try to make companies be more agile, and I know you've got some strong opinions on a certain
Me
agile
too, Bob.
framework that I won't say out loud, but I was just curious, in your mind, what do you see as sort of like the biggest impediment, roadblock to helping an organization embrace agility, become more agile, kind of break out of the that's how we've always done it sort of approach? What do you run into constantly?
The biggest problem is that Agile has been around for 20 years at this point. So anybody that thinks that it's a new radical way of doing things is way out on the rat's tail end of the curve,
Sure.
right? The people that really got it are doing it,
Yeah.
and they're not screwing around.
Yeah.
They're not saying, "Oh my God, we can't have project managers," and oh my God, we have to have quarterly roadmaps, right? You look at the companies that are really agile, and they're not doing that.
Yeah.
And some of them are pretty big.
Yep.
So what's left then with me as a consultant are two classes of organizations: the small ones, which really understand the issues and they just want some help, and
Yep.
that kind of work is great, right? Is that I can come in and I can help.
Yep.
And then the really huge ones, which have to be convinced, and I tend to turn those jobs down, is the I think it was Diana Larson, pretty sure it was Diana, said, "I'm not in the convincing business."
Right.
And I think that's a good philosophy, is that I got better things to do with my time than trying to convince some idiot that they need to be doing something they're not doing. Because agile rather is a radical departure from what they think companies should work like.
Oh yeah, totally.
And they've got this thing stuck in their head that says, this is what a company's, this is right. And what you're proposing is wrong. And that's hard to talk about. And I can say, well, if you have a business problem, the two of us can sit down and figure out an approach for solving that business problem. And of course, I'll apply lean agile principles to that when I do it. And so on a problem by problem basis, I can apply lean agile thinking. But that won't make an organization agile. Is the have you done any reading in systems programming, or not systems programming, systems thinking?
Yeah.
So you read Peter Senge or Donella Meadows or any of these like really good systems thinking people. And an organization is a system. And the best metaphor that I know for that is like a car, right? Is that the car is a system. And the goal of a car, the goal of the system, is to transport you from point A to point B. And in order to do that, every piece of the car is involved. Right. And no piece can stand alone. You can't take the engine out of a car and sit on the engine and get from point A to point B. It's not
right.
It's just Scrum trainers, and they're going to do a bunch of stuff in the engineering department, and that'll be that. And that's not the way it works, because you need to have all the support in place for that, for even Scrum to work. I'm not a huge Scrum fan. I used to be kind of anti-Scrum, and I'm not anymore. Is that lately, when I've been thinking about Scrum, I've been thinking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
And where the Earth, the entire entry for the planet Earth was the word harmless, until Ford Prefix got hold of it and he did a massive review, and after many years they came out with an updated version that said mostly harmless. And and I think about that. I think Scrum is mostly harmless.
Yeah.
Right, is that it makes you a little bit slower. It adds bureaucracy that you wouldn't otherwise have. It does stuff that is not necessary, but it doesn't hurt anything.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's not much. It's 14 pages now. And you can't even support Scrum if you don't have the entire organization around it, feeding into that, providing the necessary support. And more to the point, you can't have the rest of the organization actively working to prevent any agility from happening. And that's the biggest problem, I think, with most of the big companies right now that will never be agile, is that the real problem is not the positive, it's the negative, is that they are actively working to prevent agility.
Right.
right? And if you've got it's hard. Who wants to fight against that all the time, right? It's just it's soul sucking. You just don't want to do it.
Life's
So
too
people
short.
don't. People don't. So what ends up happening then is those organizations never really become agile, and the people that really get it go elsewhere.
Right.
And and the going elsewhere, almost everybody I know that's worked as an agile coach that's a good one has experienced a situation where they went into a company that didn't really know what they were getting themselves into and were brought in order to teach agile.
Sure.
Or broad mandate. And then they did that. And then half the engineering department ups and leaves as soon as they understand that this will never happen here. In other words, you teach people what agile is like, and they're going, "Ooh, it's the promised land."
That sounds good. I like the sound of that.
Do that. And then the question that always comes up is, are there companies that are actually doing this? And I go, yeah, sure, they're all over.
Here's a list.
Yeah, here's a list, and off they go. Right. And I've seen half the engineering department get up and walk out because the CEO was just not willing to accept it. Right. Because the anti-agile is all about power and bureaucracy and process over people and all of that kind of stuff. And when you bring in real agility, you're saying you got to give up the power.
Yeah.
Right. The hierarchy's got to go. You got to give up the power. And some very big organizations have done that. Toyota did it. Right. Can't get bigger than that. And they took all of the power, all of the decision making about how to build cars, and they moved it down to the people that were actually building the cars. They said, "I don't know how to make things better. You figure it out."
Right.
And we'll do whatever we can to make sure that whatever solution you come up with is going to become real. You need money, fine. You need equipment, fine. You need people, fine. Just tell us what you need. And many people who run big software organizations are just unwilling to do that.
Right.
So, you go in as a consultant, and pretty much every time I go into an organization that's not already agile at some level, there's some idiot. I shouldn't say idiot. Sorry. There's some
misguided
person. There's a person who has the role of project manager on the team, team level project manager, and there is no team level project management in Agile. There's no team level project management in Scrum, right? There's no project
Alan,
manager.
I need a schedule, Alan. I mean, when's it going to be done,
There's
Alan?
no project manager role in Scrum. Scrum, in fact, it specifically says in many places, the Scrum guide says the teams are self-managing. And nonetheless, here's this project manager sitting there on the team. And I'm going, what's going on? It's only 14 pages. Surely you can read that much.
Right.
And right.
It's not a 1,000-page compiler book. Come on.
Yeah, and then we get into quarterly plans, roadmaps, and all that other junk, and and people just can't imagine a world in which you're not doing that. They can't imagine that it's working. Right now, it's not going to work in some places.
Right.
And that's fine.
Sure.
Right. I don't think it needs to work everywhere. Is that some of the big you talked about estimates, right? So the no estimates trolls on Twitter, right? And if you actually look them up, which I have done, they're all working for usually giant defense contractors.
Sure.
Right. And a giant defense contractor probably can't be agile. At least not in any sense that we would find as legit. They might be able to spawn off a skunk works here and there to do a little agile software project or something like that, but the organization itself can't do it. So the people who work for organizations like that discount pretty much everything that's at the core of real agility and say it's impractical. In the real world, we can't do that. Well, in their real world, they can't.
Sure.
And that's okay. I'm happy to accept that, because you can't do it everywhere. But whether you can do it or not may or may not be a function of size. I don't know, but it probably is. You look at SAFe, and SAFe is all about size. Mm-hmm. It's that the only organizations that really take SAFe seriously are the giant ones. And none of them are software companies, which is kind of interesting. Is that Facebook and Twitter and none of those guys are using SAFe. They never will, because they know it's kind of nonsensical. But so SAFe is a process that a company that is not agile adopts because it's familiar looking to them.
Right.
And they can put the big A word into their advertising at that
Capital letter A, agile.
Capital letter A, no less. But most of those companies can't be agile anyway, no matter what they do. And SAFe is not, in that context, SAFe is probably better than whatever they were doing before.
Sure.
Right. So it's an improvement for them. So I don't have anything against SAFe as a process. The thing I have against SAFe is they call it agile, right? If they could just drop the A,
Sure.
instead of safe, right? Then I would be happy with that. Is that
Waterfall light, maybe, or
well, it's kind of water. I
I don't know.
so it's hard to pin safe down at this point because they've been taking literally every agile practice they can and saying now it's part of safe, right? So now it's become this giant smorgasbord of
Right.
disconnected stuff that rather than a single system. But so it's hard to even say what it is. But it's at least it's got some structure. At least it's providing some order to the chaos. So if you have a giant company that can't possibly be agile, it's better than nothing. Now,
Right.
whether I personally would want to be involved with that, no, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
Right? Is that I'm appalled by it. It would not be fun. So I'm completely uninterested in that. If a company is doing safe now and wants to become agile, I'd be happy to help them with that. But I have never come across a company that has moved in that direction. It seems like once you go the safe route, that's
as far
what
as
you
can
do.
get.
You don't evolve past it.
Right.
Right. It just is this thing. But you can't make everything agile. Eventually,
No.
Well,
and what you're getting at here, at least what I've seen in my career, is how hard it is to change culture. And it's this. I mean, I'm fond of saying the most dangerous phrase you can utter in an organization is "that's how we've always done it," and we get stuck in that sort of feedback loop. And you've attracted and hired and retained and promoted based on sort of that cultural fit.
Yeah.
And then someone like you comes along and says, well, the way you've been doing it, we need to change. Like, are you kidding me? I've been successful at this for 20 years doing it this way. And I think that's where a lot of that resistance comes from.
It does bring up the question of why they're even talking to me.
Agreed.
Which they do, right? And but there's a school of agile coaching, which some of my friends are part of, where they say, so what you got to do is this little stuff. Just touch this little thing over here, do this little thing over there, is make these little small changes. And I don't know what they think will happen, is they imagine that if you make enough small changes, eventually the big thing will overcome it. But my goal, my experience is the culture will kill that instantly. Is that the little tiny changes are too easy to eradicate.
Sure.
And they just the organization is just pulled by its culture back to wherever it started.
Right.
So the changes, if you're really going to make it work, the changes have got to be big. And as you say, the cultural sense is you don't have to start off with process. And that's another thing that I see really wrong in the agile community is these people think, well, if we change process and we change this process, we change that process, that things will work. And I don't think that really works either. I think you've got to change attitude first. And once people sort of understand what's really going on, the whole notion of agility, not agile with a capital A, but just agility. And they say, yeah, we need some agility. Then they themselves will start looking at that process, their processes, and go, that's not very agile in the lowercase sense, is it? Right? It's not very flexible what we're doing here. And the new business requirement changes and we can't accommodate that. That's not agile. So then they start thinking about how do we change our processes in order to support the philosophy. Right. And so you need that philosophical change up at the C level, I think, up at the highest part of the organization before you can succeed at the lower levels. And where agile fails is when it starts out at the lowest level and it tries to work its way up through the organization. And there's too much pressure to not do it. Big pressure, like you're not going to get a bonus this year because you've been messing around with this agile stuff and you're behind schedule. Right. And you're, and yada, yada, yada. And so bonus goes out the window, right? And so people have a lot of serious motivation to not have any agility in their system. And that, of course, doesn't work if the goal is to get agility, and so, the other thing that's pushing against it is that in some of the least agile planet or organizations in the world, they are successful at some level.
Yeah.
And they're not comparing their current level of success to what their level of success might be if they changed what they're doing.
Yes.
And they say, well, things are going fine now. Why should we change? And that's fine, right? If that's their point of view. Right. Their competition doesn't have that point of view. So they're kind of setting themselves up to be wiped out.
Yeah.
But it's hard to argue with that. What we're doing now is successful.
Look, we're profitable. I got a bonus last year. Why do I need to change anything?
Yeah, we're profitable. And so it's but it gets me back to Diana's thinking, right? I'm not in the convincing business. I
Yeah.
don't, I don't want the ulcers.
Well, and
If somebody understands what the problem is, I'll help them, but
sure,
I'm not
sure.
gonna.
And I think that's why you made that point about you see people end up leaving the organization. And I think that's because we all recognize pretty quickly that if you're going to change culture, that doesn't happen in 6 weeks or 6 months. That's a multi-year process. And a lot of us look at that and say, I don't know that I want to put in that much effort when I could just go work here and they're already doing it in this manner.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some organizations that have done that,
Hmm.
right? You look at, well, ANZ Bank is the thing that comes up all the time. And they've done it with some success, not complete success. Is the people I've talked to people that are working there and they're saying, yeah, we went a large way in the agile direction, but there's all this stuff that's still embedded that's not changing and it needs to. But at least they understand the need. And so there have been good sized companies, ANZ is not small, that have made that transition by saying what we're doing is wrong.
Sure.
And if you don't like it, leave.
Right.
And if you choose to leave, we'll help. If you don't like what we're doing, we'll help you find another job. Right. So you don't want people in there subverting what
Right.
you're doing because they can't find another place to work.
Hmm.
Right. So you've got to be open about it. But it does happen. But generally speaking, I think you're right. The bigger the organization, the harder it is to get any agility into that system. And it's because you can't. Everything is too embedded.
Yep.
And but again, competition will drive it eventually. Is that 40 years, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, people will wonder what the hell we were doing 40 years ago.
Totally. Totally.
But in the interim, those companies have got to die.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are going to die very slowly because they're so big.
Yes.
And okay, in terms of our personal lives, will the fact that agile is better gonna make any difference to you personally? Probably not. You'll probably retire by the time it impacts that company, right?
Yes. Yes. That is very likely.
So if you're happy where you are, well, stay where you are. I'm not.
Right.
I don't find any problem with that.
No.
Is I haven't worked for a company in so long that I don't think I'd be happy in any company as an employee.
We all have different tolerance for pain. I know I'm broken now. I've had 5 years of remote life and traveling, and it's like, yeah, I can't ever see myself go back to a quote unquote real job.
Yeah, I'm equally broken, and
Yeah.
and it's a problem, right? It's a problem among the whole agile coaching, training, teaching community, right? Because most of us are broken that way because we went off to do the agile thing, right? And we spend our lives traveling around to interesting places and talking to interesting people and teaching them, doing this fun stuff. And I'm not going to go back to what I was doing before. Nope. I could never see myself working as some cog in a wheel at a big company. Well, maybe I could. If they paid me, say, 10 or 20 million bucks for a year of work, I might be willing to do it.
100%. I mean, I have literally thought about this, Alan. Like, would I ever write COBOL? And the answer to that is yes. However, let me go talk to my financial guy first and figure out what that number is, and that's what I'm going to slide across the table. And if you're telling me that I can work for 2 years and then I'm done, I'll write COBOL for you tomorrow.
Yeah. And the same goes with me, like doing agile coaching stuff and that kind of thing, right? If a company wants me to come in as a coach permanently and they're really screwed up, so it wouldn't be a fun job.
Sure.
But if I'm convinced that at some level, somebody way up in the organization kind of understands the issues and really wants to make the change, but just doesn't know how to do it, and they'll pay me a ton of money, like enough that I don't have to work ever again, then maybe I would consider it. But for the most part, I don't want to beat my head against the wall. It's no fun to beat your head against the wall. So, but this is the case with pretty much 100% of the best agile consultants and coaches and stuff, because we don't want to really, we want to work in the environment that we talk about. That's why we talk about it. Right.
Exactly.
and having to go to some completely screwed up company where everything is going to be a struggle, where you got to fight for everything. That doesn't sound like much fun.
Right.
And
plus, you know how it can be and how it should be, and it's really frustrating when you see someone doing it in a way that is, let's just put it politely, suboptimal.
Yeah, so one of the conditions I would have to like coming into a company and that's really screwed up and fixing it, other than a shitload of money, is that I have to have absolute authority which I then would not use.
Right.
Right. In other words, the company's got to be thinking that what I'm doing is so important that if Alan says it, you must do it. And then I would never do that because it's completely ineffective, right?
Sure.
Is that but if the company's not willing to make the commitment,
then they're not
then
serious.
they're not going to succeed, right? It's just not going to work, right? So it's a normally you would never see that, right? There aren't many companies that would say you've got complete carte blanche here. Whatever you want to do, we'll do. And but again, no competent agile coach would ever do that because it's not going to be effective. Because that's sort of we're going to change everything tomorrow. If you don't like it, leave, right? That's not going to work. But but having the authority to do it makes a difference because it gets people to pay attention, which is a good thing in that kind of context. So I think it could happen, but it takes real commitment on the part of upper management to be able to authorize that, essentially.
Well, it takes that long-term view of that this isn't just something that's going to get done in the next quarter or the next year, that this is going to be a multi-year effort. I think that's part of the challenge too, is having leadership in place that's still going to be here in 2 or 3 years to see it all the way to the finish line.
Yeah, that's part of it. And part of it is that it really isn't a dictatorship. A company is not a dictatorship. It can't be.
Yeah.
So there's always a lot of convincing that has to happen in order to make things work, and that's just part of the job, right? If you're, and the to put a tyrant in place to do an agile transition, that's never going to work. Is that so? Having to go to upper management if you're doing an agile thing and explaining what the hell you're doing, that's a good thing. Right, is that if you can't explain what you're doing, then why are you even doing it? I doubt your credibility as an agile person if you can't explain what you're doing. Right, is why is this working? How will this work? Is that how does doing this get us from point A to point B? What's the advantage? Right, and you have to understand how companies function, and you have to understand how to talk to upper management, and you have to understand what's important to them. And a lot of people who are, quote, agile coaches are clueless about what's important to executives. You say, we want to talk about agile, and they'll start talking about crazy stuff, about sprints and all of that kind of stuff. And the upper high in the organization, they don't care about that. Right? Is what they
solve my business problems, Alan.
Solve my business problems, increase my market share. Yep. Things along those lines. And most people who do work in the agile world are not able to think that way. They don't, they just immediately go to whatever, right? They go to Scrum or whatever process they like, and they start talking about the details, the process details. And up at the high level, they could care less about process details, right? They want results, and the results, by their definition, is usually bottom line results. And most of them, in most companies, are willing to accept we'll improve the bottom line by having a better product, whatever that product is. So you can approach it from that point of view, is that if we do this agile thing, we will end up getting a better product faster, which means that the company can grow faster. Right? That's all legit.
Yep.
But a typical agile coach is not going to talk about that. They don't know. They haven't done anything in real business. And I've done the CTO thing a couple times, and not for large companies. It's been little tiny startups both times, but at least I got that thinking instilled in my head. And too much of the agile community doesn't understand that. They don't understand the way the executives think, and they don't understand what's important and what's not important and all of that kind of stuff. And until you get somebody who's basically working at the executive level trying to make the company more agile, it's really not going to happen because there's going to be too much pushback. And so you don't have to be an executive, but you've got to have a lot of influence at that level. And the best agile transitions that I've seen, but also the worst ones, have involved a person that is the right-hand person of the CTO. Right now, if they actually are the CTO, that's best. But in a big company, that won't ever happen. Right? Is that but if you come in as like the CTO's buddy, and the CTO really understands what you're doing and just looking for you to help with the mechanics, you can make a pretty good difference or not, depending on how good the person is. And I've seen situations where that has succeeded really well, and I've seen situations where it's completely and utterly failed because the person that they brought in to help the CTO with their quote agile transition was a complete moron who was doing it for the money and the power, and not really didn't really have the interests of the organization at heart. So it's easy to slip back.
Yeah, you got to burn the ships when you get there to a certain extent.
You have to burn, well, if you can, right? People are good at shipbuilding again, though.
Well, it's true.
And right, and I've been in organizations where there was an incompetent person who was in charge of the agile transition, and she was doing it more for power than anything else. That was her main interest. And she would let things slip back if it helped her from a power point of view.
Sure.
Right. So while I was there, they were saying, okay, we're gonna move all of the architecture to an architecture group now. And they're going to come up with the architecture, and what they say goes. And I'm going, this is not a great idea. And it didn't work out very well for them. You know, and from that point forward, I spent almost 100% of my time trying to get the people in the architecture group to pay attention to the people who were doing the work. But that's what they did, right? Is they were kind of gradually dragging themselves back to a waterfall. So they started out, when I first went in there, with something that looked kind of agile, but I left about a year later, and at that point they had pulled out all of the architecture into a separate group, and they had pulled out all of the QA into a separate. They were just
what could possibly go wrong?
Right? They were just putting a waterfall back one piece at a time, because up at the highest levels, that's what they were comfortable with, and the person who was theoretically in charge of the agile transition was interested in their own income and not really in the company. They weren't really helping, right? So they were willing to put up with that. And in fact, if this was the kind of organization where if you objected to that, you were out the door the next day, is that they just, she was in a position of power where she would just fire people if they didn't say what she wanted them to say. I almost got fired several times, and eventually did get fired. Eventually my contract was up and they just refused to renew it. But the fact that I lasted until the contract was up was actually kind of surprising for me, because I was not a milquetoast about saying what I believed, and there was no scope for saying what you believed in that organization. But it was, on the other hand, the other side of that is in organizations where people really got it. Then there's stuff that I could do that's useful. The organization might be completely messed up.
Right.
But if the CTO really gets it and says, I know how hard this is.
Yeah.
And I know that I can't do it by myself, so I'd like some help. That's a great situation. I like that. Right. It's going to take a while, but everything, that's not a problem.
Yeah.
But the idea of when the people on top really understand what's going on, then you can succeed. And it just takes time.
Sure.
Where we started with these big organizations where the people on the top don't get it.
Yes.
Right. And you can move in an agile-ish direction for a while, but they'll pull it back.
So let me loop Code with Sean into this. She's been dropping some questions into our chat here for us, and I have been dying to try to bring some of that in. So I made one comment about, and those ships were built with waterfall, so we got that going for us. And I totally agree that who wants to beat their head against the wall for multiple years on the promise that we'll get there? Sure, of course we will. But an interesting interview question here. Instead of will you hire me? Thank you, Code with Sean. What is your dev practice? What isn't working? What are you doing to fix them? And I think it's interesting how we can approach this as we're interviewing at a company to try to suss out some of those things. And given the level of turnover right now, a lot of us find ourselves in the driver's seat here. What do you look for when you're engaging to go, oh, you know what? I think I might pass on this one.
There's a lot. You can approach it from a lot of sides. If you're really going to be an agile organization, you have to have slack time built in.
Yep.
And it's got to be a learning organization. So you could start off by nibbling around those corners. So for example, if you say, if this is because I do this for a living, but it's a good indicator for me. How long does it take to get a trainer in?
Yeah.
Right. If the team decides that they need to know something, they need to know it now. And if it takes 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months to get a trainer in, months, well, that's a clue. Right. And so that's not a bad place to start, right? If I need to get some kind of training, how long is it going to take to get a training? And then you can nibble around the questions of management, right? Are there team level project managers? Is a good one, a good place to start, because there shouldn't be. If they are, then ask, what do they do? Because sometimes the word project manager is used in a way that is okay. If you look at Google, for example, they have project managers, but that's almost entirely a legitimate servant leader kind of role, where they're basically enabling the team. It's their job to make sure the team doesn't have to waste time doing stuff with the bureaucracy. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to kind of get a feel for how that's going to work, and but in terms of interview questions, right, is the ones that kind of nibble around how autonomous is the team? Who makes the decisions? How much permission do you need in order to make decisions? Money. If I need something, can I get it quickly? Right. You look at Spotify, right? Everybody always brings up Spotify, but there's some great examples there. And Spotify doesn't have budgets even at the team level. They just have a big pot of money. And if you need to do something, you do it. And the only requirement is that whatever you spend the money on has got to be for the good of the company.
Sure.
So if you spend the money on fancy restaurants,
it made me happy, and
that's on you. That's out of your own pocket, right? That's on your own dime. But if you're spending the money on something legitimate, fine. So there's a story that people at Spotify like to talk about, where they had one group in New York and another group in wherever it is, Sweden. Mm-hmm. And they're having communication problems. So they said, the way that we're going to solve this problem is all of us, 8 of them in the team, we're going to go to New York. And they just did it. They didn't ask anybody. They didn't get permission. They didn't put in budgets. They just did it. And training, same issue, right? Team that's a fully agile team, they need training. They just do it. And they don't ask permission. And so the real agile organizations that I've worked for as a trainer, I'll get a call. They say, we need somebody to come in and do this. And they'll say, when are you available? And in a really agile organization, I'd say, I've got some time next week. And they'll say, great, come on down. Right. And
next week? You're kidding me. You don't understand. I got to get procurement involved, and then there's going to be an exchange of paper, and your lawyer needs to talk to our lawyer, and
and all this other stuff. And
we're thinking sometime 2023.
Right. So, so those are things that you can look for. What have we started on? I've sort of lost track of what we started on. Is
well, it's these warning signs, and Sean points out that when the team has 6 devs and it takes months to get something, to change, or to your point, like if you need a tool, if you need an IDE, or you need a new monitor or something like that, and it takes months and months and requires, VP level approval, you might have a little more bureaucracy than you really need there.
Yeah, but even a little bit of bureaucracy is a bad thing, right? It's because it's additive. Mm-hmm. And it applies to everybody, and it's additive. And after a while, you're working at half speed.
Right.
And so there's lots of little things like that you can look for. So the main thing is that kind of the big things, if you look at just sort of lean agile thinking generally, is that you look at what an actually agile organization looks like, and there's something like 30% slack time built into the schedule. And that time is usually filled with either personal projects or some other form of learning. There might be some kind of formal training that happens. Hunter Engineering, which is one of the world's most agile organizations, they've got a daily learning hour where every morning somebody teaches something to somebody else. And so you're looking for slack time built into the system. You're looking for a learning culture. You're looking for things not to be schedule driven, but to rather be driven by the needs of the client. In other words, you want things focused on priority. You want to see whether there's actual agility in the organization. If you learn something, how hard is it to change what you're doing?
Yeah.
These quarterly roadmaps what do you mean by quarterly roadmap? Is that what happens if we learn something that renders our quarterly roadmap unviable? Can we just throw
Right.
it out and replace it with a different one? You're looking for agility, in other words, and you can see that relatively easily. It's not hard, and I think a sort of more interesting question. We all started off with, nowadays it's kind of a programmer's market for jobs. So what should you be looking for? But the other side is that, is it worth the trouble to try and change the organization that you're in rather than leave?
Right.
Maybe, but usually not. And the one of the things that goes wrong when people do this looking around for someplace else to work is that they get an offer someplace that looks pretty good, and then they say, I'm leaving, and then the company comes back with some bigger offer. And my general feeling is that if that bigger offer wasn't on the table before you started looking, you don't want to work there, right? If they're only doing it as a reaction rather than really looking at people and saying, what are these people actually worth? And oh my God, we're not paying them well enough. And if they're not doing that on their own, you don't want to work there.
But that is one of the most stunning things to me about this industry, and I guess it shouldn't be a surprise because we're always, who doesn't want to get more for less? But I've seen just countless examples where you you ask for a raise. Oh no, we don't have any money. You go get another job offer, and all of a sudden they can match or exceed that offer, and it's like,
Money.
why don't it's expensive to hire, it's expensive to bring people in, and the amount of time it takes to do the interviews, and then one bad hire and you're like, oh, isn't it just cheaper to pay people what the market is
Well,
at?
yeah. And it's expensive in way more ways than you're talking about,
Right.
right? Is because the product schedule is going to slip. And you're not going to be able to get stuff in there that your customers are screaming for. You're not going to be able to fix bugs that need to get fixed, and
Right.
you'll start losing customers as a consequence. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And the people don't. A lot of people don't seem to get that. I really don't understand it. It just shouldn't be an issue. But I look at the most agile organizations that I've worked with, and they're all above market rate in terms of the salaries, and they're constantly adjusting to make sure that that's the case. And they're all really serious about supporting the people who work for them with things like education and whatever else they need in order to stay at the top of their profession. And you kind of don't see that in second tier organizations, but the really hardcore agile organizations, you do see that. And it's just part of the culture. So flipping it around to where we started, is that what you're trying to suss out with the questions, if you're doing the interviewing, is what's the culture like around here?
Yes.
If I need to take a class, can I?
Yeah.
If I need to go to a conference, once conferences become a thing again, can I? How much is involved with that? How much permission? How much bureaucracy is in the way? Because if there's bureaucracy in the way of taking a class, you can guarantee there's going to be bureaucauccy in the way of making
Everything
necessary
else.
changes to the application.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's going to be much worse for that. So we've clearly touched a nerve with code with Sean. I'm with you, Sean. I love this idea of the learning hour. That sounds fantastic. I'd love to have the power to implement that, although my job is to play with technology, so I guess I can't really complain. And I've always felt that giving developers that opportunity to do that is an awesome relief valve in terms of, because I get people all the time asking, like, how do I convince my manager to use insert esoteric language technology database here? And it's like, well, if you don't have a chance to play with that in some way, shape, or form, a lot of us are sort of incented to, well, I'm going to make it fit right here. I'm going to use it. I'm just not going to tell anybody. And then we end up with that Galapagos Island problem where you got that one app that's written in insert whatever here, and nobody knows that that's what they did, and then it goes to production and people are like, oh, what happened? And then that person usually leaves, and then it's rock paper scissors to see who has to maintain it. But yeah, it is interesting, and I wish more companies kind of embrace that. And I agree with you too, Sean. Sometimes the grass actually is greener on the other side too. There are instances where that's the case, but I really do wish companies as a whole took this more seriously, gave developers that opportunity to learn, as
Yeah,
much
but
as it
it's what
sucks
does
to
it
pay
take
us
to
market.
get? What does it take to get that though?
I
One
know.
of the places where I worked, um, I came in. I did a bunch of. They hired me to come in and teach them agile, so I did
Yeah.
that. And essentially, half the company got up and left.
Sure.
And the CEO said they got his attention, and then he wouldn't do a damn thing in order to prevent it from happening again. And it was odd, right? You could see how panicked he was. He was, he came into a meeting with a white face, literally, whiter than normal white faces, right?
Yeah.
And I was so scared it turned my teeth white. But to quote Monty Python, but the point is that he was still not willing to give up the power that he had in order to make the organization successful. And what do you do with that? Right? Is that if you can't really make the changes, what do you do with that? And it's a hard problem, right? Because ultimately it's about ego.
Right.
And ultimately the people on top, their ego is invested in what they're doing. And if they're convinced that what they're doing is because that the company is successful because of them,
yes,
you're going to have problems.
I can't admit that we've been doing it wrong, because that'll look
Right,
bad on me.
but there are really good CEOs that say that they say we're successful because all of the people that work for the company, not me.
Right.
Best thing that I can do is coordinate. Right. And there are good CEOs and CTOs that do that, and those companies are the ones that succeed. Right, the ones where they're saying it's our success is not me, and they mean it.
That's
right?
a hard
thing
to find.
They mean it. It is a hard thing,
and because it does take a certain level of confidence or arrogance to get to those levels in an organization, and so there is a little bit of that, being able to toot your own horn, tell that story in a positive way, that is also required to get to those levels. So I can see where that becomes a little bit of a intellectual dissonance there of, oh, I can't admit that something wasn't wonderful, and how do we change it? But it is amazing when confronted with something like that, not changing behavior. But I guess you also see someone at the hospital with a tracheotomy tube smoking a cigarette out of their tracheotomy tube. So maybe that's just the condition of being human.
For some humans, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond that too, because the board has to be complacent.
Yeah.
And I've I had one. This is a company where I make jokes about the CEO absconding to Mexico with company funds. This actually literally happened in this company. He did that. He absconded to Mexico in his sky blue 57 T-Bird, which he had bought with company funds.
Of course.
And he and his girlfriend got in their convertible and absconded to Mexico. And and the VCs are going, oh my God, what happened? Right. And I had done some work for them 6 months or a year earlier, and I had left because I was just annoyed.
Sure.
And they brought me back. They said, take a look at what's going on, give us some advice. And I did that, and they would paid no attention to it at all. And so it it infuses the system.
Right.
The problems infuse the system.
Well, and as Sean says, you can't fix stupid.
You can't fix stupid.
Absolutely.
Right.
Nothing you can do about that.
That's correct. That is correct.
So one other thing I want to poke at a little bit here. Well, I mean, there's multiple. I think clearly you and I could go for another hour and a half, but I very distinctly remember early in my career having this conversation with a VP who recognized that the way we were doing it wasn't great. And she kept saying, Nate, I got to have a date. And I said, well, giving you an exact date, it ain't going to work, right? I mean, as we get closer and closer, we'll get better at this. But, out here, it's a pretty big cone. And she's really frustrated. And I finally asked her, I said, when has that date ever been right?
Yeah.
This is a woman who'd been in software for 25 years. She wasn't new to this. And she just looked at me and she said, I know, but I got to have a date. And I'm just like, what do we do with that? I mean, how do we fix those kinds of issues where, again, kind of your point with the CEO who sees this but is somehow powerless to change it? Like, So you kind of have to be the change you want in the world
Well,
here, VP person. Like,
there
help me
there are
out.
two issues there. Is one is the person I was talking about just didn't have the imagination to be able to change it, and his ego
Sure,
was too large,
sure.
right? So this particular company basically was being funded by his mother,
Ah,
right? And so he had all those strings. Is that there was a board, but he wasn't really responsible to them. He didn't have to answer to them.
sure.
And the but the thing is that the what you're talking about is somebody in the middle who's like really between a rock and a hard place.
Yes.
And people above her bosses, they can't, they're operating in one reality.
Hmm.
And then they're looking down at the ground and going, but the reality on the ground is very different.
Yes.
And you can't get that thing to work in the middle. Right. And
Yep.
there are hierarchical organizations that work fine that way. Right. The Marines come to mind, right? The military, right? Is that you can't get more hierarchical than
Sure.
that, but the people
Sure.
on the ground make the decisions.
Right.
And they don't make strategic decisions, but they don't need to be making strategic decisions.
That's an
On the other
implementation
hand, the
detail.
information that's coming up from the people on the ground certainly influences your strategy.
Absolutely.
Right. So it's a collaborative arrangement between the people on the top of the hierarchy and the people on the bottom, and people on the bottom are actually empowered, and
Yes.
information is flowing up slowly, but the system is designed to compensate for the fact that there's slowness there. So it's not like information flows up and orders flow down.
Mm-hmm.
It's rather information flows up and they say, oh, our strategy is not working here. So we need to adjust strategically in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the new strategy comes down, and then the teams figure out how to make it work. And that's the way it's not, hierarchy is not inherently bad if the hierarchy is set up in such a way that it empowers the people that are doing the work.
That's a great point.
And it's just, unfortunately, in a lot of hierarchical organizations, it is bad because you don't have that, because the power is all concentrated at the top instead of distributed out through the rest of the hierarchy.
Right. Oh, yeah. And Sean, to your point, yes, that was a waterfall mindset in an organization trying to do agile. I've seen that a lot. And Sean also points out they do teach soldiers how to think tactically as well.
Yes,
and,
they have
and
to.
you have to distribute that decision making because, to your point, they're the ones in the middle of it. And the greatest strategy is awesome until, oh, hey, turns out the helicopter, crashed on landing, and so we now need to change our approach.
Well, they're being agile for the same reasons that we're being agile. There's no time.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Somebody's shooting at you. There is no time.
We don't go
Right?
like time out. Okay, let's go get the general on the phone and figure out what to do now. Yeah.
Right. So we in the agile programming world, really, it's the same thing. There is no time for this. We have some input. We need to make a change, and there is no time to go to make that big loop. And if you make that big loop, the market has moved on long before we can make the change that would have held them. Right. And one of the things I think that really holds people back from agile is they don't understand that.
Sure.
They don't understand the speed of the market. And they don't understand that when you put delays in decisions, that the market will move past you. The market will move on before you can make the change. So anything that you do to slow down the rate of change is going to be damaging because the market can move on so fast.
Right.
Right. In the internet age, the market can move on in milliseconds. And to deliberately put delays into the process is like you're imagining that we're living in 1910.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's not the way things work anymore. But it's bolted in, right? The business schools teach it. People's golf buddies can't imagine a difference, right? It's everything's bolted in. So those are very difficult changes to make because typically the only way that they're made is that somebody screws up really badly.
Sure.
Something happens bad enough that people's attention is grabbed.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of organizations do finally confront it is they're facing an existential problem of, our market is drying up or a competitor came in that we didn't see and are clobbering us, and then we don't have a choice. It's either this or we're dead. So we might as well try it and see what happens. But it is hard to make that work. Now, when we were talking in the pre-show about a different topic, I know you didn't have a lot of optimism. Do you have optimism for us getting better at this, or of companies adapting? I mean, do you think the marketplace will kind of fix
win out
this?
eventually?
Yeah,
Darwin will win out eventually. Is I kind of don't care about the parts of the world that aren't moving this way.
Sure.
It's not my, I only have a certain amount of
Not my
cycles
problem.
that I can adopt to caring. I can't care about everybody,
Right,
not being a
right.
saint. So, if they want to improve, I'm here to help. If they don't want to
Right.
improve, I'm not interested.
Yeah, yeah. No,
But
that's the attitude you got to have, right? Like,
you got to have, yeah. And the market, as the market gets faster and faster and faster, which is what it's doing, there's less and less and less scope for not doing it in an agile way,
sure,
whatever you call it, right? The word agile has become a bad word lately, but
sure.
I kind of don't care what you call it. But there's a point at which you just don't have a choice. And if you're at the point where you don't have a choice and you're still resisting, you're going to fail big time. And that's the way Darwin works, right? Is that it's just natural selection, and the companies that are unable to change fast enough are going to get eaten by the companies that are adopting faster.
Right.
And startups don't have any problems working in agile ways,
Right. Right.
right? And and that's your competition.
Yeah.
And too often the biggest companies are looking at other big companies as the competition, and that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The competition is some lean, hungry startup with 4 people in it that can blast out a product that's going to wipe yours out of the water, but they can do it in 4 months. And it's going to take you 4 years to make minor changes to anything because of the bureaucracy that you've put in place. Right. And the little company is going to come on and wipe you out of existence.
Right.
And the big guys tend to not pay attention to the little guys enough.
Oh, right. Right. Because they're not a threat. We need to worry about
they're
our
not perceived
competitive
as a threat
marketplace and not about that 3-person startup.
So that's the thing is you look at COVID and what that's done with work at home, and you look
Yes.
at the fact that it's now become a programmer's market for tech jobs, not a company's market.
Yes.
Right? Is that, and you're looking at people who are saying, I got to work at home 2 or 3 days a week, or I'm just not interested.
Yeah.
Right. And the companies that are not willing to say, okay, they're being impacted pretty hard right now as people are leaving. And they're going to get dragged kicking and screaming by the programmers, or they're going to die. They're going to just be, they're just not going to exist anymore. So this is, I think, this is a good moment from the point of view of programmer leverage.
Yes.
In terms of trying to improve the way that the companies work as a whole. The problem is there are a lot of programmers that don't understand what to ask for either. They're not using the leverage to do the right things. And work from home is a classic example of that. Is that I don't believe in 100% work from home. I just don't think it works. I don't believe in 100% work in the office either, right? And a good compromise seems to be about 3 days in and 2 days out. So a 5-day week where you have a Tuesday to Thursday work week, and that seems fine. But I've seen too much good stuff happen from actual face-to-face conversation to be willing to give that up.
Sure.
And speaking as somebody who has basically worked alone from home for decades, the glitter wears off pretty quickly. Sure. Is that right? There's a point where you just start becoming desperate for physical contact with other people, but there's reason for that, right? Is that it helps you think better, right? Is that if we didn't go to conferences, we'd go crazy, right? Mm-hmm. Because we need that physical interaction with other people in order to be able to function. And a lot of the biggest work from home people are people that haven't worked from home alone enough to understand the downside, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so, that's an interesting point.
So but work in the office all the time? No.
Yeah.
We don't need to do that either. So and we've learned a lot about how to get reasonable work done remotely. Mm-hmm. And you can even do it, things like mob programming and stuff like that, very collaborative ways of working. You can do that remotely. And so it's not like this is a huge impediment to have some kind of hybrid way of working. But I don't think either extreme is good. I don't think working from home 100% is good, and I certainly don't think being forced to go into the office 5 days a week is good either. So, but the thing is that we're in a position now where we can try and move things in the right direction. And one of the fears that I'm seeing is people realizing that and moving to the opposite extreme, trying to push things to the opposite extreme. And that's not going to be effective either. Right. So a bunch of hardcore work at home 100% stands who are saying, okay, we all have to work from home now 100% of the time. I don't think that's a good idea either.
Sure.
And we still need to be thinking about what works, what's effective and what's not effective, and what's going to work in the long term, not just in the short term, but in the long term.
It'll be interesting to see what sort of new normal looks like, but I think it is not going back to the way things were in 2018, 2019.
No, thank God. Right?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent. It's been a great forcing function, I guess, as one way of phrasing it. But I ran into a former colleague sometime this summer, and I was talking to her a little bit about what the plan was at that work, and she said, "Well, the CEO has decided everybody needs to be in the office at least 3 days a week." And even though IT pushed back and said, we don't really need to do that, they're like, nope, everything's got to be consistent. Now, the part that I thought was really weird is if you were hired in new, you could be hired in fully remote. Now, that doesn't seem sustainable to tell existing employees, well, if you want to be fully remote, you have to leave the organization and hire back in.
That's basically it, right? What they're doing is saying leave.
And that's what they predicted. And that's what was happening is they were losing people. It sounded like almost daily. And it's like, gee, maybe we need to alter course a little bit here. And I think it's something that a lot of organizations are being challenged at is like, but I'm not I'm supposed to have control here. How dare you push back on me?
But see, that gets us back to what we were discussing half an hour ago, is that the teams are empowered, right? If you're going to have an agile organization, the teams are autonomous.
Right.
If the team wants to work at home 100%, fine. It's up to the team, and you need to look at the results, not at the input side. You got to look at the output side.
Right.
So if the team is trying to work at home 100% of the time and not getting results, that's different.
Yes.
Right. But if they're getting results, fine. I don't see any difficulty there. The only problem that I have with working at home 100% of the time is, you can get results, but you might be able to get better results if you tried something else.
Sure.
So it's not so much the doing it, it's the rigidity there too, right? You can have just as much rigidity on the part of the team going, we will never come into the office, as you have rigidity in the company saying you must come into the office 3 days a week, right? I don't want to see any rigidity on either side. Yeah. I want to see the teams experimenting around with different ways of working and adjusting what they're doing all the time, and that kind of stuff, being agile.
Well, and that to me has always been the crux of it, right, Alan? Is the whole point here is to measure what we're trying to accomplish and then adjusting based on that, and having these short little nested feedback loops. If it's working, cool. If it's not, fix it.
But it's more than just if it's not. Is that one of the traps that people get into in retros? Is they only look at what didn't work.
Sure.
Right. All these retro formulas that you see, what worked, what didn't work, what's in our control, what's not in our, I want a retro to focus on how can we improve?
Right.
Things are working fine, but how can we make things work better?
Sure.
And what can we try to get things to work better, and not focusing on what's failing so much as to because there's always stuff failing.
Sure.
Right. So the at least some percentage of your retro should be spent on experimenting, trying new stuff. Just saying, I read about this and it looks really interesting. Let's try it. Right. And I'm not seeing enough of that. I want the teams to start being creative about everything. And instead of reactive. It's not good when retros are entirely reactive.
Well, that's a great point. It's the experimenting aspect of it, and it's doing that sort of, well, we think this will improve this. Let's try it for a week. Did it improve it or not?
And for the work at home thing, too often it's binary.
Sure.
And I'd like to see the teams go, well, let's try coming in a couple of days a week and see if it's better.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try 3 days. Let's try 2 days. Let's try 1 day.
Mm-hmm.
What advantages do we have? What disadvantages do we have? Right. I don't see any point in like digging our heels in and saying, no, I must be 100% remote, or maybe. The other thing that it really bugs me when this discussion comes up is that people are not thinking at all about, they're not being creative at all about how to make things work.
Right.
If we can work better by physically getting together 3 days a week, do we have to do that in an office?
Right.
Great
point.
Right. And do we need why do we need one giant centralized office, right? Admittedly, it's easily defensible. We can put people with machine guns on the corners of the building, but that capability, right? Is that an important characteristic? It's, a big, expensive building is all about the CEO's ego. It's not really about whether you want to get work done. And so if you set up satellite offices in 30 different places scattered all over, and then you make where you live not a criterion, but at least a consideration when the teams go together.
Right.
We're saying we have all of these offices, the teams, we want a meeting somewhere like a few days a week. You can meet in any of the offices that are close. So pick a team that works for this office. And if somebody wants to drive further in order to work with a specific team, great. I don't have any problem with that. Right. But at least set up a situation where you don't have to do this horrific stuff. Right. And people are saying, I don't want to commute. And I'm going, that's a legitimate concern. How do we solve that? Right. Not you must come into the office. Right. And so there's not enough creativity being put onto solving the problem, I think. Right. And many of the problems associated with work at home versus not work at home can be solved in very creative ways that they're not even thinking in those terms, in terms of having true creative solutions, and they should.
Well, Kodo Sean says, here's the argument about, well, the company's paying for the space. Sure, but to your point, Alan, it doesn't have to be, the 28-story skyscraper with your logo on the top and everybody's got a corner office that's powerful. It could be, a co-working space in a neighborhood too, and I think that's part of what's going to be interesting to see on the other side of this is, are there more other options that people actually find more appealing? If you could go to a place that's 10 minutes from your house, it's in your neighborhood, you stay in your neighborhood and you're kicking money back in you. I mean, that could be a really good thing for a lot of folks.
That seems like a good thing. And what was I thinking? Something popped in my head. Now it's popped out.
Well, there's nothing magical about these giant city centers necessarily. I will say that the big cities, the New York, Londons are amazing for the fact that, 2 a.m. you can find anything you need. But by the same token, that doesn't work for everybody. And there are alternative solutions that kind of bridge those gaps.
Well, but if you're being flexible, then the solution will vary depending on where you are.
Sure.
Right. So people live in London and New York and San Francisco, in my case, because we like it. Right. And so I want to live close. I want to work close to where I'm living. So if I'm living in Greenwich Village, I don't mind working in Midtown, right?
Sure.
It's easy enough, right? If I'm living here in Berkeley, I don't mind working in San Francisco. It's fine, right? Or somewhere in Berkeley,
right?
But I don't want to have to. So for me, going into the office a few days a week, that's fine.
Sure.
Right? If you have people living in rural areas, then the situation starts to change. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't. This pendulum can swing in the opposite direction too far. Mm-hmm. I had a Twitter follower who eventually got disgusted with me and stopped following me, but he lived in a very rural area and basically had the attitude the world has to bend over backwards to require my needs, to accommodate my needs. And he was saying, I can't get a lot of bandwidth, so the company just has to deal with that. And my attitude was, no, it doesn't. Right? If you choose to live out there, that's fine. But you can't expect that your hireability won't impact your ability to communicate, or vice versa, rather. Right? So you're saying, I'm not willing to communicate with you effectively, but I still want you to hire me.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't buy that. I'm sorry. So if you have a company where communication isn't necessary, where the way of working involves working in isolation for a week and checking in once a week with other people, then you can do that.
Sure.
And, I don't think that's a particularly effective way to work, but it is a way to work. Mm-hmm. And if you can find a company that wants you to work that way, that's fine.
More power to you.
More power to you. That's great. And I really mean that. I'm not being sarcastic at all. But on the other hand, if you can't, or if you want to work with a company that's not willing to put up with your conditions, something's got to give. And I know it's not going to be the company.
Yeah.
And so, the whole work from home thing, it's going to depend a lot on where you are and how convenient things are. Here in the States, we have the worst possible situation, right? Because there's no public transportation infrastructure to speak of,
Right.
and we're spread out.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of the worst of all worlds. And that kind of tends to drive people toward that commute tends to drive people towards working at home more often than not.
Sure.
I think if you start looking at places like London and Paris and places where they've got a great transportation infrastructure and people are used to living in very dense areas, there's a lot of London that's not the suburbs. There are suburbs, but even the suburbs around London are more dense than they are in the States.
Agreed.
And the issue there, there's transportation, right? Is the tube system goes everywhere.
Yes.
You look at the new Crossrail, and it's going like almost all the way out to Reading, and it's going, or I think it does go to Reading, and it goes all the way almost to the ocean on the other side, or the channel on the other side, and that's part of the subway system. Right? Is that it's going to cost you, what is it, £7 is the maximum fare to get into work. It's not a big deal.
Nope.
And so the point is that here you have an infrastructure and stuff that's set up for people to work together physically. So then the question becomes what's more effective, right?
Yeah.
At that point, the market's going to start driving it.
Right.
And if the companies that are located in those kinds of spaces work more effectively because people can get together without having to go through hell 3 days a week, then those companies are going to succeed and the other companies are going to fail. It's Darwin again.
Right.
So I think what we're going to have happening is we're going to have gradual movement. If things keep being as binary as they are in terms of the American demands on the workplace and work from home and that kind of stuff, and things have not settled by any stretch of the imagination. But if it settles in a place that the work from home stands want, I think what's going to happen is that all of the innovative, interesting work is going to move to places where it's easier to not work from home, where it's easy, right? And so we have a choice in the United States about either improving the transportation infrastructure or driving, is that there's not really much in between. Maybe self-driving cars will be our salvation, but the infrastructure can't stay in its existing state and end up with, I think, a viable work model. So we're too spread out, and it's too hard to get from point A to point B. So either we've got to stop being so spread out, or we've got to fix the get from point A to point B problem.
We've covered a lot today, my friend, and like we're getting awfully close to 90 minutes, and I know we can keep going, but no, this has been fantastic. I agree with Sean. Sean, this has been an amazing conversation. I agree completely, and I think I'll sum up a little bit of Sean's comments and like do what works. Do
what works. Absolutely.
I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Be agile.
Be agile, man. I mean, oh my God. Well, I probably should let you go because I'm sure you have something better to get into. And I mean, I didn't even get remotely close to any of the topics I normally talk about. I don't think I brought up Ted Lasso until right now, which
you didn't.
Is it even in one of my shows if I don't bring up Ted Lasso? And I'm desperately waiting for season 3. So it's all good. If you haven't seen, and I'm blanking on the actor's name, the person who plays Roy Kent, he's also one of the writers on the show. He was on Seth Meyers' show recently and gave a fantastic interview about how he does not understand American football, and it's well worth 7 minutes of your time.
Okay.
So anyway, I would encourage you to watch Ted Lasso, Alan. It is the best show I've seen in a really long time. It's fantastic, and you would like it too because it takes place in the UK. So there's a lot of good London jokes in there, and I can make my kid crack up by just saying, "How do you take your tea?" So it's good stuff. But well, my friend, thank you so much for your time. This really has been an amazing conversation, and I am desperately hoping that you and I are going to be in the same meet space sometime soon in 2022.
Yeah, it looks like London in May is going to be possible.
I think that's going to happen. So hopefully, hopefully I see you before then.
We have enough time.
Yeah, but worst case, I guess I'll see you in May in London.
Yeah.
And we're gonna go to eat. We're gonna go eat at a really good restaurant. Okay, I can tell you that right now.
We'll go eat at a really good restaurant. I promise.
Outstanding.
Great.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Next week, I've got my first returning champion, Ken Cousin, will be back with us to hang out, and so we'll see you next week. And Alan, thank you again, man. I appreciate it. Cheers.
You're welcome. Pleasure.